Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia Jid, and I will be presenting our paper, Writing Out the Storm, Designing and Evaluating Tools for Weather Risk Messaging, which was co-authored with Professors Jennifer Spinney, Priyank Chandra, Lydia Chilton, and Robert Soden. For this presentation, I will start by summarizing the study at a high level, provide some background and motivation for this work, outline the objectives and the two studies that comprise this research, before briefly outlining some discussion points. At a high level, this paper explores the design space for creating writing support tools for risk communicators and aims to better characterize current practices and risk communication related to extreme weather events. A natural question that may arise is, what is risk communication and why should I care about it? Risk communication is a real-time exchange of information between experts or officials and the public during hazards. And it's really important because risk communication, good risk communication at least, is set to cause a cognitive shift in the audience, which may result in potentially life-saving behavioral changes. But to do this, the risk communication literature has found that these messages must contain certain thematic and stylistic elements, which we term best practices and which are the focus of much of this work. With that being said, the creation of effective risk messaging remains a challenging task, as risk communication professionals must often contend with varying degrees of certainty and competing priorities in a high-stress situation. Such challenges may result in hazard-related gaps in the flow of information and risk perception in the population, which the UN has noted may benefit from technological and digital innovation. And that's where this study comes in. As a first step towards better understanding the design space for risk communication technologies, this work undertook two related studies. The first was a quantitative analysis of risk messages issued by Environment and Climate Change Canada to understand patterns related to the presence of best practices in risk messaging across Ontario, and to identify ways to improve the efficacy and inclusivity of these messages. The second was an interview study with risk communicators and emergency managers in the same province to examine the design of tools to better meet their needs. And this brings us to our first study, an analysis of ECCC risk messages. For this analysis, we examined approximately 9,000 risk messages issued between 2020 and 2021 from ECCC for Ontario. These messages spanned 4 event categories and 21 different types of weather events, which you can see in the figure on the right. To evaluate these messages, we did 3 things. First, we calculated the average flash reading e-score, a common metric of text readability, by event category and event type. We then engaged in inductive and deductive thematic analysis, where the deductive codes are based on best practices in risk communication. Finally, we used our thematic analysis as the basis for an algorithm to semi-automatically label the data. In this figure, we see the themes and their definitions, where these themes were the best practices that served as the basis of the deductive coding. This includes information about things such as hazards, locations, and recommended actions. To identify the presence of these themes in the corpus, we developed an algorithm to semi-automatically classify the data. To do this, we identified a set of keywords or phrases that were associated with each theme and used that to label the message. The reason we chose this approach was because the data is highly structured and repetitive, with frequently recycled text. As we later found out from ECCC, risk communicators often use templates to create them, so that this method was well suited for our corpus. Given this, we first used a set of keywords to specify our algorithm and then evaluated it on 10 random examples. If the accuracy was below 90%, we updated it with additional keywords and phrases. If we reached our desired accuracy, we then tested it on 50 new messages to confirm that this accuracy was achieved on unseen data. In this figure, you see the results of both the thematic analysis and the semi-automatic message classification. The first panel is simply an ECCC risk message, where we see that the structure contains 3 elements: a summary of the event, information about the location, and the message body. The message body was the focus of the thematic analysis and the semi-automatic message classification. In panel B, we have a message labeled with thematic analysis, and in panel C, we have a message that was labeled semi-automatically with our algorithm. In our paper, we report the average flesh reading e-score by event category and event type, and the prevalence of themes associated with best practices in risk communication. I referred the audience to the paper if you'd like to review these tables in more detail. For our purposes, two results are particularly important. The first is that the difficulty level of the messages ranged from fairly difficult to standard difficulty, and on top of that, there was large variation in the presence of themes associated with best practices. In the ideal world, risk messages would be written at a 5th or 6th grade reading level, so either easy or very easy to read, and they would include as many of the best practices as possible. And so addressing these two concerns, the reading level and the inclusion of omitted themes, are straightforward ways to improve the efficacy and inclusivity of these messages. It also acts as a starting off point to begin designing tools for risk communication professionals, which is the focus of the second study. For this study, we undertook an interview study with 10 risk communicators and emergency managers in Ontario, and we asked them to evaluate 4 risk messages and a potential writing support tool. In this figure, we see the risk messages that were shown to participants. Example 1 was a baseline risk message, so this was just a real risk message issued by ECCC. Example 2B was a risk message that has been supplemented with text associated with omitted themes. Example 3 was a message that has been customized for members of the visually impaired community. And the final example, example 4, is a risk message whose reading level we lowered to a 5th grade using an AI chatbot. The text in blue denotes changes to the baseline risk message, and additional details about how these messages were developed can be found in the paper. Finally, we showed participants a potential writing support tool that notifies the user of omitted themes and suggests their inclusion. From these interviews, we highlight several results in our paper, which I'll briefly discuss now. First, participants overwhelmingly noted the importance of including the omitted themes in the risk messages. In their telling, these themes added a degree of specificity that enabled the audience to personalize the risk and understand how to act, such that it was important to include as many of them as possible. With that being said, although participants agreed that the second example, which included the omitted themes from historical risk messages, was a nominal improvement on the baseline, they similarly critiqued the additional text for lacking specificity and likened it to a legal formality. All in all, our participants noted modest gains in the efficacy of the messages, although they highlighted persistent concerns with jargon, technical language, and the reading level. Which leads us to our second finding, which is that the language of these risk messages may be confusing to the audience. It might fail to capture their attention, or worse yet, it could be a disincentive to read the message entirely, all of which are serious threats to protective decision-making. In a similar vein, participants noted that the use of metrics, things like 60 millimeters of rain, are hard to conceptualize and understand for the layperson. Perhaps most interestingly, although we use the chatbot, an AI chatbot, to be exact, to address the reading level of the messages, participants highlighted the counterproductivity of this endeavor. Our participants agreed that the messages did contain simpler language, but there were still persistent issues with concepts and jargon. Furthermore, despite instructing the chatbot to maintain the format and tone of the original message, our participants worried that the simplified message was now too casual and thus lacked urgency and credibility. In one participant's telling, there's a psychological effect of receiving a message from Environment Canada, where its formality gives you a sense that it's coming from a body of experts. One of our other major results concerns the merits and design of a risk communication writing support tool, which participants argued could benefit experienced and inexperienced risk communicators alike. For experienced risk communicators, our participants noted the benefits of a tool that checks messages for the elements of effective risk communication, especially given the fast-paced nature of their work. More importantly, such a tool could help inexperienced risk communicators. In the current emergency management framework in Canada, individuals such as fire or police chiefs are often tasked with communicating risk to the public on top of their primary responsibilities. For these individuals who may lack formal training in the field of risk communication, such a tool can ensure that risk messaging complies with best practices. In addition, our participants noted factors that would determine the adoption of technology, things such as cost, data privacy, and usability, and they also noted some potential features of this technology, although we refer the audience to the paper if they would like to examine this further. Our final result concerns the risk messages that were customized for people with visual impairments. For this message, our participants belong to one of two camps, which I have termed skeptics and proponents. First, we had skeptics of the message who critiqued it because, in their telling, the purpose of risk communication was to reach a broad audience in a timely fashion. These individuals argued that creating risk communication for one group would entail creating it for all diverse groups. However, their evaluation of these messages did improve over time as we began speculating about different types of technology that could reach individuals and groups directly. In contrast, the proponents of these messages were much more positive at the outset, and they critiqued current risk communication for being too exclusionary. For these individuals, many of whom had personal connections to the visually impaired community, the specialized message had the potential to improve the protective decision-making and safety of members of this group. As one participant put it, many of these groups are infrequently considered in these communications, and they deserve better risk messaging. Based on our findings, our paper highlights a couple of design considerations and recommendations. First, writing support tools for risk communicators should account for varying levels of user expertise. While it's true that this type of technology might reduce the mental workload of risk communicators and teach less experienced communicators about the elements of persuasive risk communication, this divergence in expertise may also lead to automation bias, which is the undue deference given to automated systems. This is a safety-critical domain, and so we may need to design technologies that account for and potentially limit this. Our paper also highlights potential features of a technology to help create messages consistent with message design theories, although again, we refer the audience to the paper for additional details. In the case of AI, our participants noted an aversion to its use in risk communication, in part because current risk messages are already flawed and AI systems based on them would simply recreate these shortcomings. Instead, the use of AI for traditional tasks, such as language translation, may offer more immediate benefits to risk communicators. With that being said, audience trust in risk communication is already a well-documented challenge, and something that the introduction of AI in this domain must contend with. Research in risk communication and explainable AI may thus be instructive for successfully introducing AI in this domain. Finally, our paper highlights a central tension between producing risk communication for a general audience while also meeting the needs of diverse groups. As many of our participants argued, there is a need for and benefit to specialized risk communication, and the affected groups, or particular groups rather, are perhaps the best positioned to create them. So there's a real potential for participatory approaches to the design of risk communication. As we point out in our paper, design methods that focus on the skills, abilities, and resources of individuals and communities may thus be the most productive for this. This concludes our presentation. I want to thank our interview subjects for participating in this study and the audience for taking the time to watch this video. If you are interested in this or related work, you can search for the Toronto Climate Observatory, which is currently situated in the University of Toronto, for similar work.